I mean, I'm not going to push that on anyone else, but for me, that's very important. Like, I need to always be pushing myself to grow, because that's the only way I can like fully care for my daughters and for my wife and for the people that I have a responsibility for. Um, and you can't stop, because if you stop, you degrade.
I'm your host, Hannah Frankman. And on today's episode, I'm speaking with Henrik Karlsson. Henrik is the author of the Substack Escaping Flatland. And in today's episode, we talk about a couple of his pieces surrounding education, about the phenomenon of popular education in Sweden, its history, its proliferation throughout Swedish culture, how it expresses today. And we talk about his piece on the childhoods of exceptional people and how some of the observations about how successful and exceptional people were raised can translate back into how we educate our own kids. We talk about Henrik's approach to homeschooling his kids. We talk about his approach to writing. We talk about the micro school phenomenon. We talk about education as a thing that is a lifelong pursuit, not just a thing that you do in childhood and then graduate from. We talk about the phenomenon of writing on the internet and how the internet is creating a modern day republic of letters, and how access to information on the internet might drive a renaissance of value around becoming a lifelong learner and pursuing ideas. I always enjoy talking to Henrik, and this was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy listening. Henrik, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Hannah.
I've been very excited about this one. I don't remember when you first crossed my radar on Twitter. I think it was your Popular Education of Sweden article.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
I remember us interacting after that piece like a year ago, maybe.
Yeah, but I read that piece and I shared it with a bunch of people because I thought it was fascinating, partly because some of my family is from Sweden. So I was like, maybe this is actually just some family background in this, but also because it was such an interesting case study that proves a lot of the hypotheses around education and intuitions around education that I think a lot of people pursuing independent paths have about the possibilities that can ensue from localized education. But it was also just a fantastic piece. And you were clearly somebody who was a very good writer, but also somebody who thinks deeply about education and obviously many other topics too, because your Substack is full of stuff. But it's been such fun to read the essays that you've written since. And so I'm very excited to dig into those today, as well as some of your own background, your own education, the education of your kids. And maybe we start there, because you are not just theorizing about education on the internet, you have kids of your own too.
Yeah. Now that's kind of a rule of thumb for me when I'm writing, to sort of keep myself intellectually honest. I only write about things that I'm practicing and that I can kind of see if the ideas make sense. So a lot of the things I write about are related to me thinking about how to raise my daughters. And that's been like something that's obsessed both me and my wife for many years, since before they were born. So we homeschooled them. We had to, it's illegal to homeschool in Sweden. So we knew even before we had kids that we were going to have to leave Sweden, because we wanted to have we didn't know we wanted to homeschool at that point, but we knew we didn't want to do what we were doing in schools. We were both working in schools, and we had sort of ideas about how that was blocking innovation and the things we wanted to do, and wanted to have the space to explore that. And that kind of naturally led into homeschooling eventually. So we ended up in Denmark, where it's legal. Do you have any specific questions about what we're doing differently?
Yeah, well, first of all, how old are your daughters?
Yeah, so the old one is turning 6 soon. We're at the dentist, and she's got her first kind of wiggly teeth now. She's like feeling very adult at the moment, and the little sister is turning 2.
Okay. Is it common for people to relocate around Europe to be able to homeschool?
It's getting more common. It's like we're far behind the US, but I would say maybe something like 200 or 300 families have left Sweden, which is where I know the numbers better. And there's probably like 1,000 families that are trying to leave, but I mean it's very hard because it's not like in the US you can just go to the other state and it's basically the same. You have to learn a new language, and you might not even, you will not get the same rights. You will not if you move and so on. So it's a very painful thing. So a lot of families can't do it, but there are increasingly families doing it and big communities forming in different countries. So where I'm at, it's mostly people from Sweden, Denmark, and Germany that are kind of moving here, because Germany also, it's illegal there too.
It seems, those numbers seem very low to me, but at the same time, the difficulty is so high to make the transition. It makes sense that not a lot of families are doing it, but at the same time, I'm very curious about the overall attitude towards homeschooling in places like Sweden and Germany. Are there quite a few people who you think would be homeschooling if it was legal and the resistance is just too high to move to a new country? Or are people less open to the idea of homeschooling than they maybe are in the States, where at this point it's like almost 10% of the population is not in public schools anymore?
Yeah, I mean, we're all, especially like in Sweden, there's a very strong culture of kind of, which is beautiful in many ways, that like this solidarity, people are really like taking care, and it's a very kind of beautiful, a lot of grassroots movement. It's a really, really nice culture in that way, but there's also, this conformity you're supposed to play part, and so that probably has made it much harder to go your own way and do that. But the legal part is of course very important. If you see if in Poland or countries on that side, I think the numbers are much higher. So the legal part, of course, makes a big difference.
What's the attitude towards homeschooling like in Denmark? If you have a lot of expats moving there to homeschool, are people pretty friendly towards it, or is it still kind of a weird thing there too?
It's still kind of a weird thing. We're kind of in the community where I'm at, we're in sort of in the process of shifting now. It's a very, I've taken a very sort of active approach in trying to integrate us as much as possible into the local community, because I don't want to feel like we're sort of a parasite that is just coming here and living in a parallel society. So we spend a lot of time hanging out and they start to value that, because we have time to be part of associations and do things and take part and arrange stuff. So they're starting to see us as a sort of valuable thing, but that sort of changes the attitude when they see it's just normal people and they're really friendly and helpful and they're doing things that the other people don't have time to do, and that's really valuable. But we're in that kind of process where people, until they meet someone who's homeschooling, of course they think that's strange, they've never heard of it, and some, especially older people, can be kind of mean about it, but you have to understand that change is hard for people.
Yeah, it's very hard for people, and it's interesting. In the U.S., the culture around homeschooling has changed quite a bit, and the general attitude around homeschooling has changed quite a bit. When my family was first homeschooling me a couple decades ago, people looked at you funny when you said you were being homeschooled. They just didn't understand it. And people are much more friendly towards the idea now. I can be at a random social gathering and say that I talk about homeschooling on the internet, and people, it at least registers for people. They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. They're not necessarily excited about it, but they have a frame of reference for it. But
Yeah, no, but it takes time. I mean, you have to be patient with that and do that kind of emotional work of helping people, meeting people. Like, so, I try to. So there are like this is a fairly small scale community, so which is nice because like the politicians and so on, you'll see them in the store. So like and sort of the kingmaker on the island who kind of controls the community where I'm at. I saw him first time I saw him in the store. I knew he was opposed to homeschooling. So I just walked up to him, started talking, and I was like, "Can you drive me home? Because I don't feel like biking home today." And he did that, and we talked, and you have to just do that, and like all those interactions like that really makes a difference over the long term, where you build trust and relationships. But you have to just do that work.
Can you talk more about that? How you think about building trust and relationships, especially when you're in a new country doing this thing? Like you're a foreigner doing a thing that feels very foreign to people.
Yeah, so I did when I came here. So to learn the language, I took a job at a museum. So as I work as a sort of curator at a museum part time, and that was sort of very deliberate because it's a very outward facing. I get to meet all the politicians. I get to meet all the sort of important like people that work in government in the local community. So now it's kind of a deliberate choice to have this kind of public role, which helps me kind of network and build that trust and become sort of a trusted person in the community. And I think that's some people when they're homeschooling, they get kind of afraid and they sort of back out, and they're afraid of politicians, they're afraid of all those things, and that's very counterproductive. I understand it, but it's very counterproductive. So I take a sort of a very sort of outgoing approach where I try to put myself in situations where I can meet them, even if they don't like what I'm doing. But like when I help them out with stuff and we find sort of common ground and we can work on these problems together, they see the value of what we're doing, and that builds trust.
How are you approaching designing a homeschool experience for your girls? What ideas are you building it around, or what type of educational approach are you taking or / plan to take? Because they're still very young, but you've worked in schools, your wife worked in schools, you've been researching education very heavily. What are you pulling in to design what in your mind is the ideal education experience for your kids?
Yeah, so my academic background is in anthropology, and I think that shapes my thinking in many ways, because as an anthropologist, when you're thinking about education, like if you're looking at education across societies, you think about it more broadly. It is the process in whereby a culture or a community reproduces itself to make sure that when old people die, young people can fill their shoes, and as new problems arise, knowledge can be evolved to meet those things, and you kind of look at the kind of flow of information through a community. So that's the perspective I have on education. It's like, how do we, like, it's a very abstract way of thinking about, but how do we ensure the flow of information through a community such that young people become competent adults? So I think about it, and when you think about that, the schools doesn't really make sense, are very problematic because they're kind of disconnected from the flow of information in society. So so you're trying to move people out of this flow of information that's going around in society and in the culture, and you're trying to sort of artificially recreate it there. And that's a very tricky process. It can be done, but it's a very tricky process. And I'm much more interested in approaches where you try to figure out ways of giving access. So the most important thing to me is just that. Like, I don't think so hard about how I tutor my daughters and things like that. I think much more about, like, who am I? Like, how do I make myself a competent role model for them? How do I give them access to other adults and to other kids, and to see things, and I'll bring them along when I work. I would do a lot of projects. Sometimes when I'm in this office here, my daughter will sit next to me and write, and she's going to be an independent researcher when she grows up too. And we'll talk about things, and we'll read books together. And I'll try to, as much as possible, kind of like online, there's this idea about like working in public, where you try to sort of think aloud and share the process of your work so that others can learn from your thinking and your journey. And that's how I approach it at home too. It's like I try to do projects where they can learn by sort of mimicking what me and my wife are doing. So when like we're rebuilding the house, and we're growing food, and we're researching, and we're programming, and we're doing stuff, and they're kind of brought along on that journey. And then that's kind of complemented by like 1% of tutoring, like certain skills like writing and some math, just to like speed it up a little bit. But the important thing is like the role models and the what they can immerse themselves in.
This is a very unschooling style approach that you're taking now. At least that's how it sounds to me. I don't know if you'd push back on that.
I push back on that a little bit. I mean, it depends on what you mean by unschooling, but I like unschooling as long as you take a really deep and deliberate process about how you design the environment and the social context and the work they have access to. I'm not adverse to like setting limits and telling my kids what to do and so on to a certain extent. But so I'm not like, maybe you'd call that like a radical unschooler. I'm not like that. I don't have any problem with like tutoring and strictness and so on. But so I pick and mix from different things. But yeah, there's a big element of unschooling.
What about as your kids get older? Do you feel like this approach will carry through, or do you have theories about how you might want to structure their education a little more, or set different types of guardrails or exposures as their intellectual capacity increases?
I have a feeling, I mean, it's always evolving. So it's hard to tell. It's because it's this dialogic thing, like as they grow older, you learn things, and it's always adapting. So I can't predict that, but I think something like this will follow through until they're about 85. And after that, we might do something different.
Yeah, the people are much more friendly towards a very organic approach when kids are younger. It makes more intuitive sense. And I think a lot of people have a harder time as kids get older. I saw this when I was growing up homeschooled. We lost a lot of homeschoolers to attrition as kids got older, because it's harder to separate the kid from the academic model as you get into middle school and high school. And it feels like you're preparing them for college and the real world, and the stakes feel higher and the academics feel more complicated.
Yeah, there might be like slightly different. I mean, first of all, I navigate as a researcher outside of academic context. So like, I don't figure that. I know you can do it. So like, if for some reason they don't feel like, or they can't like get traditional credentials, I know they can do it other ways. But also, I mean, I come like Sweden and Denmark. It's you have free education. It's like really easy to get an education. Like it's not higher education is not as competitive and as it is in the US. It's like not something you think about in the same way as you do in the US. It's like, you can go to university if you want to. It's free. Like it's just this kind of blah blah thing. It's not so important.
You talked a little bit in your essay about popular education in Sweden. You talked about how you were immersed in this popular education culture growing up in Sweden, and that when you went to university, it felt lesser than your experience in this more alternative, self-directed, or community-driven, perhaps is a better term, culture of learning. Can you talk about this a little bit, like your own experience in contrasting a more self-directed, community-driven education model versus the traditional system that most people default to?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I have a mixed sort of educational background. So I did go to traditional schools. I was intensely bored there. And then in Sweden, there's like this, as you say, this popular education thing, which is basically, we can get into it in more detail, but it's basically you can very easily get small funding to get like a room or a house where you can do fun projects. And you like, I think I started doing that mostly like around 16. I remember we got our first house, me and a few friends, and we make music and we'd had seminars and so on. We do different things, do book clubs, and use the funding we bought a computer and we bought books and we so on. And so that's a like big thing. So I had a lot of interesting like projects with different like scenes and people that I did funny projects. Like we would get like a lawyer that had worked on a war tribunal, and he would come and drink beer and talk about like war tribunals with us, or we'd have like a sociologist come in and we'd have conversations about like work culture, or we'd do like these fun things where we'd read books and talk and or do projects, and it was a very intense, like super nerdy thing where we got super deep, and it's just like and it's just like it's not is it even an educational system? It's like there's no grades, we just decide what we want to do, what books we want to read, and just people show up and read it, and it's become so intense. It's like you go really deep because you only go there because you love it. No one's going to care if you did it. And that becomes so intense and deep. And then you go to university, which I did later, and you have the same. I mean, it's basically the same thing happening. There'll be someone that comes in and talks, and you'll have read some books, but people are just kind of going through the motions. And they're kind of trying to figure out like, what am I supposed to say? And it's this, and they're kind of in this game that I've learned in schools where they're trying to sort of predict what the teacher wants them to say. And it's just this kind of weird game going on instead of this intellectual thing. Whereas, when it was self-selected, it's just the real thing and becomes so intense. And then you do that over 5 years with the various groups of people. You can go really deep and far and do crazy stuff.
You talk about this a little bit in the newsletter, but for people who haven't read it yet or aren't familiar, can you explain really quickly what this culture of popular education in Sweden is in the present day? Because it's a historical phenomenon, which we'll get into in a little bit, but it's something that's still quite prevalent. And it's a fairly, you make it sound in the newsletter like it's a fairly common experience for people to be a part of something like this.
Yeah, I think something like 70% of Sweden's population has at some point been a part of it. I think 7% something is active members on a yearly basis.
You said 70% at some point in their life have been a member?
Yeah.
That's insane. That's so high.
Yeah, it is. It's so kind of, it's funny when because Swedish people, like when I wrote up, like for a Swedish person, it's just kind of mundane. It's like, it's super boring topic. It was hard for me to like even think about writing that because it's so like, feels so boring, that's just how it is, but I mean, it follows sort of a power law. Some are living in the system and some maybe go on a lecture once in their life. So it's a power law, but there's a fairly large group of probably like 100,000 people that are like doing it on a weekly basis.
And by it, you mean what?
Yeah. So it's basically, you have to be at least 3 people. And then you could just say like, yeah, we're 3 people. We're between 3 and 20 people. You say, we want to do this. And it doesn't matter what this is, basically. And then you get a small funding, which you can use to buy books, or you can pool the money together. If you do meet up I think you get like something like $2 per person per hour or something like that. and then you can pool that money to buy stuff and get people to come in and pay rent for maybe some room in a cellar somewhere or something like that. And then you just meet, and usually there are like several rooms close to each other, and people move between them, and you just have like fun projects going on and hang out and yeah, read books, talk, play in bands, do pottery, like it's like very different things. And once we even like got the president, like the general secretary of the UN, to come in and give a lecture. So like you can do really big things like that, and you can do pottery or a band. So it's basically whatever you feel like doing. If you can find two other people that want to do it, you can just get a room and do it. So that's it. And
that's amazing. So what are the parameters for a topic, for a study group? Is that what would you call it?
Oh, it's called a study circle.
A study circle. There we go. What are the parameters for something like that? Like, could you start an improv comedy study circle?
Sure.
Could you?
Sure.
So it's any topic you can think of that you might want to learn about.
Yeah, there's probably some rule that says you can't do like hate speech or you can't like learn how to make a bomb. Like there's probably some rule like that, but like beyond that, I doubt there's a rule. Like,
so you could have like a weekly dinner discussion club about whatever ideas everyone in the club finds interesting that week, and that would count as a study circle.
Yeah, probably. You might need to frame it somehow, but yeah, you can pull it out.
And this is just a normal part of Swedish culture, that that these things exist. And if you're interested in learning something, you might start a circle of people who want to learn it with you, or find one locally that already exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's not everyone knows they can do this. There's like I've gotten some Swedish people that write, it's like, you're just making this up. This like, this isn't true. Like, have you gone to, like, I can give you the number, like, tell me where you're living and I can tell you where to go. Like, there are places in every village where you can go. But yeah, so a lot of people don't know it. And it's got, for a lot of people, it's got this kind of dull, like they think it's boring. It sounds boring. It's like these old movements from the early 1900s. It's like a lot of the things I've done has been through like the temperance movement, which is like this movement where you shouldn't drink. It's like really old and dull. But like the things you like, once you push through that and get to the inside, is really cool things going on. But a lot of people can't see through that facade. So there is kind of a divide. So a lot of people don't really know about this ecosystem. But I mean, it's compared to other countries, it's huge.
Yeah, seriously. It's something that in like the US used to have a much richer local education milieu than it does now. It used to be much more common for people to self-organize. Which we've written about a little bit. A lot of people here aren't familiar with that either. But generally speaking, it's a pretty rare phenomenon, what you're describing, and a very foreign idea to a lot of people. And you talk about this a little bit in the newsletter, so I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this, but how did this come to be in Sweden and not anywhere else? What made Sweden special?
Yeah, so I don't get into like why Sweden so much in the piece, and that's hard to say, but there are probably sort of deep historical roots to why Sweden, and one is like Sweden is kind of a frontier community because it's so far north. So like we've had kind of the boundary toward the north in Sweden has been like the west in the US. It's like you could kind of go north and escape the state, and you could go north and escape their aristocracy, which meant like, and when you have that kind of border, it's very hard for an elite to get full control over the country. So Sweden is like Sweden, Norway, and Finland. There's like the only places in Europe where there was never like a true aristocracy. There was never a true class society. So farmers were so self-sufficient throughout pretty much all of history, and that creates a different culture when you're not like a serf, but and so that builds a lot of social capital, and it builds a lot of like you have to learn on your own, you have to do it, and that like kind of a frontier culture that existed, and that so you had that like in the 1800s, and then like as Sweden was kind of going into the industrial age, you had these like very like like these strong farmers that had like they knew how to take care of themselves, and so they of course they started to think about like how now society's become more complex, we're going to get a vote and so on, we need to figure out how to, I mean, we're going to run this country like the farm. That's what the workers and farmers were thinking, and they were right, of course, because that's what ended up happening. They ended up like forming these communities, and so there started circles, but there were also kind of some retreat type schools they did as well, and they would farmers and workers would kind of educate themselves in like accounting and how to like sit on a local council, and then eventually, you know, they use that knowledge to sort of take over the state and kind of form the sort of modern Swedish welfare state. So that's kind of the background to it.
And you talked a little bit in the newsletter about the sort of intellectual ideal origins of this movement. And if I understood correctly from reading the newsletter, you talked about the idea of, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, so please correct me if I don't, but the idea of Bildung. How do you say this correctly?
Yeah, well, that's German, so I'm not sure if I can pronounce it, but Bildung. And in Swedish we say Bildning, but Bildung. So that's kind of the guiding idea.
Which is the idea of shaping yourself in the image of God.
Yeah, that's the origin of the film. If you go back to like the 1600s, that's it. Then it sort of became secularized in the 1700s. So I would translate it as kind of self-cultivation. It's like this shaping yourself, and it's like, let me quote here to see what the sort of definition. This the idea that you should be able to. I mean, you should be able to control your emotions. You should sort of internalize healthy norms of a healthy community. You should take individual moral responsibility. It's fairly sort of related to the sort of the liberal arts tradition. In some ways, you would read the classics, but you would be. But it's very much, and the way I think about it is kind of this idea about sort of communal self-improvement. It's you're supposed to improve yourself to be able to better serve your community. It's that kind of idea, which is a kind of an interesting mix between like what is typically today, like the right and left, where it's like either you focus on yourself or you focus on like the community should take care of things, but it's like, no, you should focus on yourself as a part of a community. And of course, some people think like that today, but I think it's a very powerful ideal to build a movement around, because it's comes to this very kind of strong bonds in such a movement.
And if I read your piece correctly, and again, correct my misunderstanding if there's anything here that feels off to you, but it feels like that ideal was a big driver in the movement gaining traction in the beginning. Like it was a very, which is necessary when you have any type of self-organized and self-driven education movement. You need to have intrinsic motivation to drive it forward. And that intrinsic motivation has to be something that you're striving towards either being able to do or becoming. Like if you're not trying to become something, why would you exert the effort to learn something unless someone is coercively telling you you must in order to do whatever thing you want to do, which is how a lot of people's relationship with education is structured. And this is very different, but there's this ideal that people wanted to be becoming that was inspiring the effort being spent on learning. Does that track with what?
So. Okay. I think so. Yeah, I think it was like a strong optimism. Like they really felt like they had the capacity to change society and their lives, and they like really knew they could do it, and they can make their lives and the lives of their children better. And they were so motivated by that and felt so empowered to do that. And then, they got win after win where they were able to do that and were able to build better communities, and then gradually like a better state and so on. I think is that ideology, like that you can become better and serve your community in a better way and have a richer life, really created a very sort of healthy like context for building this movement. And I think it's I think it's much harder to build around like you should like learn to get ahead of yourself. Like that works for some, like this hustler thing, but I think it creates a much more kind of sustaining, to build a true movement, that to feel that you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your children, you're doing it for your neighbors, and you're doing it together, and you're supporting each other, and you're holding each other accountable. And that kind of creates this kind of momentum that was able to build this big movement. And then once they were able to get some small funding, the state funding has never been super big. It's kind of small numbers, but like it was enough to kind of push it over the threshold. So because there were movements like this happening in the US as well and in the UK, but they never got over that threshold really. So they like were able to build this infrastructure.
And what was, if you had to summarize your hypothesis about what was different in Sweden that allowed it to get over that threshold, was it just that the ideal was stronger of what people were working towards? Was it the funding being accessible? Was there something else at play that made it easier for it to gain and then maintain traction?
I mean, so one thing should be said about it, it's a small country. Like when this happened was like probably like 2 million people, right? So it's easier to, and it was a homogeneous society. So it was a lot easier to build trust, and it was easy to get influence because it was a small place. It's much harder to do something like this in the US. So that probably played in, and then that kind of history of never being fully oppressed. So you kind of have that self-sufficient attitude. But I think also they did a lot of good decisions. Like they were very actively kind of fighting against professionalism. Like it's still not like professional in any way. The houses are really rough. Like the first place we got there was a hole in the window. We would rain in to the room we had. You would never, like, it's not professionally in a way. They dodgily fight that. It's got to be simple, easy. There's no admin. There's like super simple and I think it's so easy to want to make it slick, and you want to have like this good design and nice places. But once you start focusing on that, you kind of tie yourself down, and you have to be very kind of obsessed about like the core thing you're doing. And I think they sort of managed to keep the focus on that. So yeah, I think that's sort of a confluence of like the funding and having high trust in a small country and some of the decisions they did. But what's your experience of like, what is the closest sort of equivalent where you've grown up? Is there what would be the equivalent?
Well, I'm thinking back to my own experience growing up, and I think the library system is one of the closer equivalents because that is government funded, it's public access, and it's a space that people can use. So when I was growing up, my family, and particularly me, would get involved with different things happening at our local library, and homeschool groups would often utilize this space. So I remember one year we had a homeschool group that I was a part of was working with the library to host a chess club. So I think it was twice a month, a whole bunch of homeschoolers would descend on the local library, and we'd bring a bunch of chess boards and set up in one of the rooms, and we'd play chess games with each other and learn how to play. Some of us were better at chess and would play more competitive games. Some of us were learning. And I did, that same library hosted an English as a second language conversation group at one point in time, and I volunteered with that for a while, just doing like conversational practice with people who were learning how to speak English. I was part of book clubs at my library, and then I started one later when I was in high school and ran one for a while. So it's somewhat equivalent because, again, you have the like locally funded resources, the space. There's not a lot of admin or bureaucracy that you have to work through to start something. You just have to get the director of your library on board with what you're trying to do. And so there's no standardized process for that. Like, it completely depends on the whims of your local librarian. I was very lucky to have very nice small town librarians that I also had relationships with because my family definitely contributed a large amount to their circulation numbers because we were checking out a lot of books on a weekly basis. So everybody knew us, which helped a little bit, I think. But we had really great librarians that were excited to have the space being used. And then when I started teaching after I graduated from high school, my first entrepreneurial project in education was teaching writing classes to a homeschool group. And again, the library let me use their downstairs room to run those courses. And that was like a for-profit venture for me. I wasn't making much, but I was making a little bit of money. And I wasn't paying for the space or anything. The library was letting me use it because I had a relationship with them. But that's probably the closest equivalent that I can think of. That, and then, maybe universities letting people use the space for other things.
Yeah, we used universities for some of the things, for the bigger lectures and so on. We would borrow lecture halls from the university. Yeah, I mean, it's very close. I mean, we used libraries too, but it's like the difference is like you can go much crazier because like you can, like I think I've kind of renovated up like 2 or 3 facilities with like, once we got like an old abandoned church and we turned it into this crazy space. So you can like, and there was like in nowhere, so we could just go crazy there and like do death metal concerts, and you didn't have to care as much. So you can go, but so it's basically like libraries, but you can start a library if you want to, and you can play death metal in the library.
I think part of the difference here compared to what you're describing is that there's less of a culture for it here. Like, people do use their library, but I think in circles that's considered to be a little bit more of an older person's activity. Like, you're kind of a nerd if you're hanging out at the library, if you're under like 40. But there's also, like, it's just not a cultural norm to be a part of a study group for something. If you're involved in a church, you might be part of a Bible study, and that's sort of a normal thing in your community to do. If you're really literary, you might be part of a book club or something. You might take a class if you're interested in a particular topic, but it's much more like, when I think about talking to people about learning new things, people are much more commonly saying, oh, I'm interested in photography. I think I might try to take a photography class somewhere, and it's going to cost a couple $100s, and you're taking it from an expert, and it's much more of a top-down activity for the average person. I don't think the average person is saying, I really want to study the philosophy of Ayn Rand, so I'm going to start an Ayn Rand reading group with 3 people who are interested in her work, and we're going to work through a handful of her. We're going to read her novels or work through a handful of her philosophical texts, and we're going to meet once a week to discuss them. I know people who do that, but they're definitely the exception, not the rule. And it sounds like that's perhaps a little more common culturally in Sweden.
Yeah, and it's becoming less common. It's like it's been declining slowly for the last 50 years. But as I said, like, it's still 7%. It peaked at 10%, but I don't think it was more active. But I think something switched in Sweden, and I think something probably similar happened in the US, maybe a little bit earlier. But in the 50s, there was this kind of switch around schooling. Where like there was this campaign where they were talking about the strong state, and they wanted to professionalize universities, and and at that point, kind of it's something shifted where you had to have like a university degree to have a credential. It kind of changed, and after that, these study groups have become more hobby-ish. Before that, they were more serious and doing accounting and doing math and the classics. Now it's more common to see like pottery and stuff. So there's been like a shift because of the incentives. And we've been sort of kind of schooled out of that way of thinking, but to a lesser degree than you have in the US.
Well, I think in some ways the same shift has happened here, and maybe on a longer time horizon, because it was in the 1920s here that schooling became much more sort of universally standardized across the country. We like really truly had moved away from the one-room schoolhouse model and the local school model, and schooling became much more of a national endeavor and a national government endeavor as opposed to a local governance topic of discussion. And that definitely, you can see the cultural, like the generational shifts as that has become more and more ingrained in how we think about education. And we're moving away from that now. In the US, there's a lot of momentum around different alternative models, and there has been it's been really strong for about 15 years. It's been growing, I mean, honestly, since the 70s, but it's gained a lot of traction in the 21st century. And there's a lot of appeal, not just around homeschooling, but also around things like micro schools and local private schools and things that are much more, localized, grassroots, not top down, but bottom up, which is much more what you're describing. How do you feel like these relate?
Wait, so let me say something about that. I was just thinking, because I like to think about homeschooling as sort of the unbundling of education. Like you take this thing that's kind of being bundled together, and then you kind of rip it apart, and people kind of moving to their families and start. But that's just kind of the first step, and then people start meeting up in groups and they start to do things together. And as you kind of scale out, we haven't yet seen like the full development of what happens. Like, because there's like certain things that become possible to do when there's like 1% homeschoolers. Like all of a sudden it's possible to meet up, and when you get to 3%, it's possible to do something. 5% maybe micro schools makes sense. At 10%, so we're still in kind of this kind of learning trajectory where we're kind of bottom up evolving new structures. So like homeschooling is going to be an important thing, but like as it scales out, we're going to invent new structures around it. So I think that's sort of an exciting process to see that unfold, and it's going really fast right now because there's been this kind of phase shift around COVID.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of innovation happening with different types of learning environments that are tailored specifically to the problems that homeschoolers are starting to face when they pull their kids out of the system. And they say, well, we need another place for our kids to go while we're doing other things like working or home maintenance or whatever. We need a place for our kids to go, maybe a couple days a week for a few hours. And so like community centers for kids or like co-working spaces for kids start to emerge. So there's a lot of iterative creation like that that's happening. But I don't know how familiar you are or aren't with the micro school movement at large. So I don't know if this is a question you can speak to, but I'm very curious about the parallels between, because there is, before the contemporary learning circles phenomenon in Sweden, originally there was more of a localized, slightly more traditional education community that was emerging.
Yeah. That's a parallel thing. It still exists. It's kind of a parallel thing. So which is called the folk high schools, which is now it's typically for people that have graduated like normal high school, but like it used to be instead of high school for farmers. where they had more of a structured kind of dialogue oriented approach, which was was really powerful early on. It's still kind of a cool place where you can go and get like sort of a retreat for a year and like hang out with like-minded people. Not as important anymore. But yeah, it's not related to micro schools because it's kind of for an older group. But there's kind of interesting to see. So because micro schools are also kind of more. Yeah, but there's deep similarities between micro schools and like study circles. But like where the difference is perhaps like there's someone that kind of sets the vision for a micro school and it's slightly more hierarchical. And it might have like richer structure to it. Like it's just not just one thing. It could be many things, but there's similarities to that kind of fluidity of it all, because you can have form micro school and then you can kind of split it and make more micro schools and reshape them and so on in a much easier way than you can do with like a big school with 500 kids in it.
Yeah, the ability to innovate something that large is very limited because there's just so much. It's a very heavy thing to try to move. But if you have a micro school of 10 kids or 10 adults who are continuing learners, which is one of the things that I find so interesting about this learning circles model, is the emphasis on continued education. But something like that is much easier to iterate upon, adjust as you go, turn into something new depending on the needs of the people who are there, maybe change it later when you have new people involved who have different needs. But
yeah, and it becomes especially powerful. Like, so one of the big use cases is for bands. Like that they use this to get from bands, and it's really powerful to watch bands. I've spent a lot of time. I haven't played so much in bands, but I really like hanging out with bands and like watching their work process and watching how scenes kind of evolve. So I spent a lot of time in these kind of rehearsal spaces, and then you have like 20 rooms with maybe 40 or 50 different like study circles, are in fact bands, right? And you'll see kind of how they share ideas about how to structure their learning projects and how to structure. Like it's really fascinating, and then they move between them, and it's just like this kind of really fascinating thing to see how they do. And then they'll do things and they'll show each other and try to impress each other, and it's like that's a really cool one. Like that's pretty interesting idea. Let's have like 10 micro schools, and they're all kind of competing and trying to impress each other and do fun things and have that kind of meta level over smaller units.
Maybe I'm just a total nerd, but everything that you're describing sounds so fun to me. Why is the momentum around this waning? Do you have a theory on why?
I mean, yeah, I guess it's the same thing as it's like why everything kind of social capital related has been waning. Like the rise of television, the rise of computers, people are working longer hours, they are commuting more, they are spending more time consuming things, and it's the opportunity cost. Like you don't have time to invest in doing these things. So if you read someone like Putnam or like Bowling Alone, like about the US, similar processes. People don't have time anymore.
Do you think the internet can replace some of this phenomenon? Because I think there's a strong argument to make that in some ways it already has, especially Twitter has built these communities of people who are not geographically adjacent, but who are very ideologically adjacent, who can find each other across the globe and connect and learn together. Do you feel like some of the magic of these study circles can be replaced on the internet, or is there something about it being in person that's important?
They have their pros and cons. Like it's really amazing when you find these Twitter scenes or Discords, like and it can be like 100,000 people that are obsessed about making jazz hip hop beats, and they're like learning really fast, and it's a similar feeling, right? And you can get like also, I've done some of that with my blog where I will invite like guest lecturers or professors, and we'll bring a community together to talk about it. It's kind of trying to recreate that thing, and it's easier because you can just call in on Zoom and you can get like the best professor, like someone who's working at OpenAI doing the latest AI models, and they can just come in to my study circle and do it. So there's like that ease of you doing it is really powerful, and I really love that. But there is something to the in-person thing where you're just having all these group kind of interrelating, and you're drinking beer, and you're kind of doing weird stuff, and you keep going until 4 a.m, and then there's a big party. Like there's something to that as well. Like you want to have both.
Yeah, I think the mixture is, I mean, I've optimized for the mixture in my own life where I'm living in Austin, Texas currently, because that's where the highest concentration of people who are interested in the same ideas as I am are based. And I can meet up with those people multiple times a week and have in-depth conversations late into the night, as you just described, about the things we find interesting. But simultaneously, I'm also spending a lot of time on Twitter. I'm writing on the internet. I'm meeting other types of people. I'm having these podcast interviews where I can talk to people I find interesting about ideas that fascinate me. And the balance works. And I agree that for me personally, it feels ideal. But there's also, I think generally culturally, we're moving much more towards internet-centric interactions like this. I think it's easier to find people that way. At least it has been in my experience. And
we're still so early on the internet. It's like, I think it's going to come better, and but there's still like so many things that still has to be evolved. It's like we're getting in there, but it was like social media this is just the first generation of it. We're gonna evolve this and get more of that, because there's certain things that are lacking, these kind of spontaneous interactions where you just run into each other and talk for a bit, or where you can hang out. And like, we're getting there. It's gonna get better, but we have to keep like inventing and iterating on this.
What about the importance of group learning versus solo learning? Because in your other favorite piece or my other favorite piece of the ones that you've written, and all your Substacks have been fantastic, but you wrote an article on the childhoods of exceptional people that was also phenomenal. And one of the sections that you wrote about was the importance of unstructured time and also alone time for a lot of these exceptional people that you were studying. And I have a lot of thoughts on this. We'll go down this rabbit hole for a little bit, but there's a potential like tensive pull between these two ideas that people could get caught in, where if you're over optimizing for always learning things with people, which I personally think can be very beneficial because you're sharing energy, sharing ideas, sharing motivation and momentum. It can be much easier to go down extended rabbit holes with friends than it is to perhaps pour over them alone for extended periods of time. But at the same time, these exceptional people that you were describing in your newsletter, many of them had extended periods of time where they were totally alone and not getting any inputs from anyone else. And something about that alone time is what catalyzed their obsession with a question or their road to mastery of an art form, and is part of what led them to be very influential, creative people in whatever field they ended up mastering. So as someone who's studied both of these phenomena, and I see them as being complementary, not at odds. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but how do you think about the balance of this, especially when you're thinking about creating a learning milieu for yourself, but also for your kids as they're growing up?
Yeah, no, it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So, I mean, I think it's a kind of a sequential thing. It kind of, you need different things at different phases. And it seems, if you look at people that do exceptional work, they tend to have that fairly early on in their lives. They'll tend to have, like, it's very common that, they're sick in bed, they can't go to school, they have to spend their time with books, or or I mean, the sample I took, like 70% were homeschooled at least until age 12. Like, and that was not because I like homeschooling. Just like that was, I just picked random names that are geniuses, and that was how it turned out. And so, and often like their guardians would just like tell them, yeah, go out into the yard and be there for 6 hours, and you're not gonna play with anyone. And sometimes that was pretty depressing, and but also kind of just put them in this state of mind somehow. Like when you are super bored for like 200 hours, something kind of happens to you, your head. You start kind of generating things that will excite you, and things like that. And there's also this thing, and now I'm kind of more speculating, but I'm sort of thinking about my own experience. There is this thing where when you're in a social context, your identity becomes sort of locked in a certain sense when you're in the same context. So, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last 2 years when I've been writing a blog, because it's been going quite well. So like the number of opportunities that have sort of come my way has changed, and in that process, like I'm clearly not in the same place as I was even 3 months ago, because like the possibilities that open up for me kind of change fairly rapidly when you're having kind of a networks effect, and you're getting kind of exponential growth on your network. The landscape you're in shifts fairly rapidly, but my identity does not shift as rapidly, because I'm still in the same kind of social context. So I still think about myself in the same way, but that way of thinking about myself is no longer true. Like that's not accurate, an accurate assessment of how the world looks and what I feel like doing. But I feel like when I'm in the loop and I'm writing and I'm working in public and I'm hanging out with people and I'm talking to people like you, it's like amazing, but it kind of sort of locks me into this mode, and I need to break out of that and like take a month off when there's been like radical change, to just kind of almost. And when I'm all totally alone, I mean, not totally alone, I'm with my kids, but like I'm kind of blocking off the internet and all kind of input from that world, somehow kind of my identity sort of loosens up. I'm no longer what I used to be, right? And that makes it possible to kind of reshape my identity when it kind of loosens up, and then when it settles back in, it kind of shapes in a new shape, which is better fitted to what I know about myself now and what I know about the world now. And if we go back to anthropology, like as an anthropologist, like of course I like to think about like the rites of passage, like a liminal phase. Whenever people are changing identities, they are taken out of their society. They reduce their names are taken away. So when you're going into the military, they'll shave your hair, they'll take your name, they'll call you shitface, and so on, and they'll remove your identity because that is necessary for you to then gain a new identity as a soldier, for example, right? And so I think it might be something like that. When you are not in a social context, your identity kind of sort of dissolves, and it helps you see more clearly your interests, your curiosities, your needs, and also how the world is. And then you can sort of better orient yourself. But then, of course, once you've had that insight and formed that identity, you need to go out into the world, because you don't know everything. You need other people to scaffold you, to mentor you, to give you feedback, to bounce ideas off, to be in a scene. But then you kind of start overloading and start changing, and then you need to go out again and kind of reshape your identity. And then you might go into slightly different scenes and slightly different relationships and do it again. So for me, it's this kind of back and forth process. Do you feel like, do you ever do that like that? Like where you have to reinvent yourself and go away?
Yeah, I do. I actually relate very much to everything that you just described. Whenever I've gone through a big transition in epoch in my life, and there have been a few so far where it's like, I was in my homeschooling era, and then I took a little time after I finished high school before I decided what I wanted to do, because I needed space to just exist without any expectations or any parameters or any real, not just external expectations, but expectations I was putting on myself around what I should be to see what I liked and what I wanted to do. And the path naturally emerged from there. And then I worked for a startup apprenticeship program for years, which is how I got my start in the education world. And when I finally left my job there, I took an 8-month sabbatical because I had no idea what I wanted to do next, but I knew I needed the space to let everything settle and see what emerged when I didn't have any expectations on myself to be anything in particular. And I just noticed what I gravitated towards and what I was a different person with, I wanted to do different things with my open time than I had 4 years prior when I'd been taking my last break. And I needed the space to figure out what I wanted to do. And when I was nomading around the US for years, and my travels were very much planned around these seasons where I'd have a few months in a city like Austin where I'd be around a lot of people that there was a lot of input coming in. And then I would go like hide in the mountains in Colorado for a month and hardly see anyone and spend a lot of time hiking and laying out at night, just staring at the stars and just being and seeing what was left when all of the noise settled and it was quiet again. And usually my best ideas come from that. And I feel like even in my creative cycles, I find road trips very purging in that energetically for me. So if I haven't been on a road trip for like 3 months, I start to get a little itchy. It's like, I need a long weekend of thinking about absolutely nothing. Like I'm starting to get I'm about due for one now. So I'm kind of getting itchy. But yeah, I feel like I've had a very similar experience to what you're describing with needing these seasons of quiet to come back to myself.
But you also, when we're talking earlier, sort of at the thing I was talking about, like in childhood, like there's something, that it's particularly sort of valuable in childhood to get this thing. And because you talked about being sort of lonely for long periods in your childhood, and you kind of like that.
I have very strong opinions about this, and they're very controversial because people have a really hard time with the idea of letting your kids be alone. But I'm certain that quite a bit of who I have become as an adult traces directly back to the fact that I had significant seasons of my childhood where I didn't have a lot of friends, and I would see the friends that I did have, maybe once a week. We'd have our co-op days once a week where we'd spend a day with other homeschoolers. And besides that, I would spend most of my time at home. Like there were seasons where we would have classes multiple days a week, and we'd visit my grandparents and we'd go to the library and see the librarians and stuff. But there were also, especially in the summer, there would be seasons where I would leave the house once a week to go with my mom on her errand run. And besides that, we would just be home, and it would just be my sister and I and my parents. And in a lot of ways, it was really hard on me because as an adult, I like to structure my time where I have a lot of extroverted inputs because I find conversation very stimulating and very good for idea generation. As a creative, I like the conversational input and output, but it was hard as a kid to not have that. So I started writing fiction because I could imagine having all of these conversations. And so I became a writer. And I don't know that I would have spent as much time writing if I'd had input all the time from other people, but spending thousands of hours in my childhood writing everything from essays to plays to short stories to poems to novels, the works. I learned how to write and I learned how to organize my thinking, and that's 100% translated into, obviously, what I do as an adult. So I feel very strongly about this. I think that everyone worries about under-socializing their kids, especially if they're homeschooled. It's one of the great internet memes if your kids won't be socialized. But I think we over-socialize our average kid by having inputs all the time, and they never have time to be alone and figure out who they are, which I think is a critical thing. Like they never find their inner compass and the things that hold a magnetic charge for them because they're so busy assuming that what they are interested in is the same as the things that all the people who are inputting their own, like their signals are getting crossed with everyone else's. And they never have a chance to really think either and discover what they're interested in. But this is a very controversial take because I've made this case to people and I've had them say, well, maybe this is just a case of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like you're better off for it, but that doesn't mean that the average kid is. And I can't speak to the average kid, but I also have a fairly strong intuition that I'm not really that much of a fringe case. I just had sort of a fringe circumstance that gave me a different perspective. But I'm curious what you think about, like, is this something that you think the average child benefits from? Or do you think these exceptional people who had alone time were just, they got lucky that they were strong enough to withstand
it? I don't, and I don't think sort of an ethics committee would sort of like running the experiment. It might be the case that like there are sort of higher incidents of like mental health problems in kids that are kind of too under socialized. Might be, I'm not sure. Like, but it could be. It seems like a lot of these people that are exceptional also are troubled, right? So, but that might just be also that they're sensitive and like very intelligent and sensitive and intelligent people are troubled because they experience the world and life very acutely.
Yeah,
I don't know, but I do think. I was thinking about like the socialization kind of discussion that comes up as sort of as an anthropologist. Like the way I think about it is like, when you think about learning and when you're learning a skill like socialization, it is like it's a skill like anything. And how do you like effectively learn a skill? And sort of the most effective way to learn something like socialization is usually by being immersed in a community. So in that sense, it's kind of right. You need to be immersed in a community, but it matters what community it is, because like if you're learning, say, it's a sort of an apprenticeship, right? And in schools, there are no masters. Like there's no one. It's just like people that are equally bad at it. And that's like, imagine like if Leonardo da Vinci would just have been hanging out with his other like 14-year-old people that like to make finger painting, right? He wouldn't have become Leonardo da Vinci, but he had masters, right, that he could apprentice himself to. And that's like how it works. You have these kind of layers. And I don't really understand that idea that like, socialization, because like it's not a good community structure for learning socialization, because for that to happen you need to have people that are really good at socializing that you can imitate and that you can observe, and you also need, like when I'm hanging out, like when you're in a homeschooling community and the kids start fighting, they don't know how to handle a fight. They just fight, and somehow some adults seem to think it's like good that they should just fight and they'll figure it out, but that's not how knowledge works. Like we've had, like, it's called civilization. We've learned how to not like kill each other in fights, and we can pass that on. But for that to happen, you need to have role models and you need to have people that can scaffold. So like if my daughter is fighting or some kids are fighting, I'll go there and tell like the way you're fighting now is that's not like a smart way of doing it. Like maybe if you start trying to kind of say what the other person thinks until they say, yes, that's what I mean. And then you switch roles. And that way I've scaffolded them. And like some people would think like, no, you should let them do it. Like, but no, like that's not how you learn. That's not how Leonardo da Vinci learned to paint. Like someone took his hand and said like, this is how you do it. And then eventually you start to imitate that. So for socializing to work, you need to have a community where people scaffold each other and where the role models, you don't want to have this chaotic thing where there's people that don't know how to do it.
Yeah, but you can yes, you need the social interactions, you need the role models, but the socialization argument kind of falls apart when the traditional schooling socialization argument falls apart when you frame it like that, because where all the, like, if you're putting your kid in a classroom with 30 peers who are at the exact same socialization level that they are, who's modeling the good socialization for them?
It tends to have the opposite effect. Like,
yes.
Teenagers will come home and then they've learned really bad ways of having arguments, and they'll just kind of smash doors, and they'll be like they've kind of moved in the wrong direction because they've been socialized. They imitate bad ways of socializing because they've had no one to observe.
Yeah. But you can get that socialization modeling from a lot of different places, not just peers. It's better when it's a community-driven thing, to go back to the much earlier part of our conversation. But it's also something, I think it's hard to have a prescriptive socialization recipe for raising a perfectly adjusted, creative kid, because I think kids are also very different. The amount of socialization I needed versus my younger sister needed was very different. And we were growing up in the same family, but we're two different people. And I'm more extroverted, she's more introverted. We needed different things. So really, I think my takeaway for parents is it needs to be an intuitive thing, but also don't be as afraid of the fringe places that culturally we're very scared to go, because sometimes that discomfort is important too. The loneliness, the boredom, the ability to find out what's interesting to you when no one's entertaining you, the ability as a parent to take away a lot of the inputs that pacify boredom, but that don't lead to any constructive development, like the sort of brain candy, the games, the screens, the meaningless conversation with another bored friend to fill the time. Like, taking out those inputs, we can be very afraid of doing that. But it seems to be a necessary ingredient in raising creative people. I don't know how that does or doesn't map to your experience. I'm actually very curious about that too, what your relationship was like to boredom growing up. So, you seem very comfortable with it as an adult.
I've been bored.
So, I know what that feels like.
It was the pre-internet days. I mean, I had a lot of friends, so we would often do things together. I grew up in a kind of countryside, a small town of 600 people. So I had a lot of fun friends, and we would go do things. So I wasn't so much bored. We always, went out. We found abandoned houses that we would kind of renovate and make into film studio. Yeah, it's this, and it's no wonder that we ended up then later going into popular education, because that we were doing it already. But I remember so clearly, also when I couldn't find friends, because we would go from door to door, and when you couldn't, and I didn't like to play video games or anything, I thought that was boring, then I would just walk. I'd walk and walk and walk for 5 hours, through the woods or through around the village, round after round. And I can't really recall what was going on inside me, but I think it was something important about that. But I think I maybe did that a little bit more than the average kid, that walking around on my own. I wasn't a total outsider, but I wasn't a total insider either. I didn't like the things that other kids in my village liked. That, but I was funny enough that they didn't bully me or anything, and it wasn't really a bullying culture. But I kind of, especially in the teenage years, I didn't like to go to parties and things like that. I just preferred to kind of read books and go on walks. And I think that was, really shaped me in important ways. And also, I was always ahead in school because of that, which also shaped me so much, because school became just this empty space where I'm just waiting, and then I would go home and learn things. And that put up kind of a really healthy relationship to learning, because I kind of associated learning with what I was doing on my spare time. And and I just continued to do what I did. Then I was bored, so I would make up projects, or and not make, and it kind of evolved. And I'm still doing that. It's still exactly the same project that I'm involved with now, but now it's kind of a professional thing, and it's been a professional thing for, I don't know, 15 years. But for the first maybe 8 years or so, it's just play, and then it can still play. It's just I'm just doing the same thing. So I think that probably played a big role in shaping who I became.
I think that's pretty common. There are a few common threads among the internet creators and the internet intellectuals. I don't know. I need a better name for this class of people that I'm describing in my head. They are the internet intellectuals. But there are a few common phenomena, and what you just described is one of them, where it seems like these types of people who are a little more open to exploring ideas and are a little more creative tend to share a similar sense of having some time as not necessarily a full-on outcast, but slightly separate from their community at large. They also tend to be continually interested in ideas throughout the scope of a lifetime, instead of just siloing information collection as a thing that happens in the early season of your life, and then you graduate from that and you move on to doing other things, which is part of what school gets very wrong, and part of what I think is so cool about the popular education movement in Sweden that we've been exploring is the fact that it positions learning as a thing that is a constant, not a seasonal, meaning like the first epoch of your life. You are a learner, and then you go on and you do other things, and the learning is behind you. It makes it much more of a continual way of being, as opposed to a thing you graduate from. And I find that very powerful. And I think that's something that's very lacking in most people's perception of education. And I think it's one of the biggest things that culturally we've gotten wrong in the 20th, moving into the 21st century.
Yeah. No, it's so important. For me, it's even like, I mean, I'm not going to impose it on anyone else, but for me personally, it's just, even a sort of an ethical imperative to be learning. Because, I mean, we know this from, if you look at studies, like once people stop learning and pushing themselves, like you take your driver's license, right? And then for the first maybe 5 years after you take your driver's license, you get better because you get practice. But after 5 years, if you're not pushing yourself to like become a better driver, which no one is, then you start declining. So like after 25 years, like after being a driver, you're a worse driver than when you got your driver's license, even though people think they're getting better all the time because they're driving, but they're not, because they're not pushing themselves. And therefore they're becoming dangerous. Like so it's even like ethical, like to be an ethical person, to like to care for your community and for the people, your family. You have to push yourself, because if you're not pushing yourself, you are actually degrading in your capacity to care and to do good work for others and for yourself. So, I mean, I'm not going to push that on anyone else, but for me, that's very important. Like, I need to always be pushing myself to grow, because that's the only way I can like fully care for my daughters and for my wife and for the people that I have a responsibility for. And you can't stop, because if you stop, you degrade. That we know. Like, if you go to surgery, if like you get like someone that's like an old surgeon with white hair, they're much more likely to kill you, because you think they're experienced, but they're not. If they're not pushing themselves, some are, and they're exceptional, but those who are not, they're getting dangerous after some time.
That's an interesting argument to make around the ethics. It's also a quality of life argument too, or there's a quality of life argument to be made where life can be this iterative and changing and evolving thing if you're continually learning and acquiring new skills and trying new things, but you have to be making a conscious effort to be moving in that direction. It's also something I'm maybe over optimistic, but I'm rather bullish on the idea that we will see more of a culture of learning in future because it's going to become more necessary just because of the rate of change of the world we live in, less the physical day-to-day, which is actually changing very slowly relative to the 20th century. But in terms of technology and how technology is impacting the way we work and the types of work that we do, things are moving very quickly. And because of that rapid change, some iteration in terms of your knowledge base is going to become necessary to survive as somebody who's building things, working, doing any type of intellectual work at all. You're just going to need a consistently adjusting skill set. So I'm curious to see if there will be sort of a renaissance around learning as a lifelong pursuit. I'm a little biased because I would like to see this occur, but I also think there are pockets of the internet that are making this cool again and kind of not necessarily reviving the, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this again, but the Bildung, is that how you said it?
Yep.
The like reviving, like we don't have that level of ideal in, at least not in any pockets of the internet that I've stumbled upon that have enough traction to be meaningful in their impact yet. But there is some level of this ideal of like the internet intellectual entrepreneurial type that people admire. It's sort of become this like heroic archetype that people want to be like. And I may be a little biased in my analysis of this, but I suspect we're going to start to see a bit more of this.
Well, I think both. Like, I think the rate of change we're approaching will put a lot of people in a really bad place. Like, a lot of people will be sort of culturally unable to adapt, and there's a large risk for a lot of disruption and a lot of people having a hard time. And I don't know what to do about that. But I think you're right that we're seeing this kind of culture evolving. And I mean, a lot of it's kind of centers on San Francisco. It started there, these kind of cultures, and then they kind of are spreading. And I mean, and that's the typical pattern you see all over time. I've been reading a lot of, because of this, like thinking about this particular thing, like what happens when technology changes and sort of a new way of organizing social life is made possible as the internet has done, and where a new way of living is necessary. And so thinking about that, I've been going back a lot to like the 13, 14, 15, 1600s, which is kind of the age after the introduction of paper in Europe, from the Arab world, right? And then later the printing press, but that's kind of a logical extension of the paper. Paper is the important thing, and because once you get paper, you can start to write letters very cheaply, and that changes everything. Because before that, people were just like extremely isolated, like they would never talk to anyone outside of their villages, so really crazy isolated. And then all of a sudden, they could start to write letters, and that kind of opened up the possibilities for something new. And what happened was that like nerds would start to find each other, and they would like give like these merchants paper letters they would kind of pass on, and they were forming these networks, and it became known as the Republic of Letters. And in these networks, that eventually kind of spawned what we know as the Enlightenment, because like over hundreds of years, these intellectuals or nerds kind of shared ideas and started to evolve norms and build institutions, and then kind of write philosophy, and they kind of invented the modern world in these networks. But it started out with small groups. It might be, maybe it was like 20, 30 people in the beginning, and they were writing letters. And then some people were getting really influential. You had people like Plutarch, but Erasmus, for example. And then people would observe him and they would read his letters and his books, and that they would learn his style of communicating, and a new way of being was kind of spread. And then letters then were copied and spread outward to new people. And eventually, over a long enough time, that way of being became like pretty common. Like not all the population, but like 10, 20% of the population like became this kind of bourgeoisie that could kind of reflect on things and have an intellectual life, and they would read novels and so on. But it took hundreds of years to do that. We're going to do it much faster now, but that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to see these small networks, and I consider myself sort of a part of that, kind of an outshoot from this network that is kind of clearly centered on San Francisco. And it's kind of spreading and evolving ideas and networks, and we're kind of developing new practices and new tools, new ideas, and figuring out, like, because there's so many new possibilities and so many new problems, we have to reinvent everything, and we're doing that. And some people have figured it out, but it takes time to kind of develop that cultural know-how and kind of scale out that culture. But that's the process we're in.
And I think the Substack phenomenon is it's a fractal piece of a much larger whole, but it's a good metaphoric representation of what's happening. This decentralized publication network where people are exploring ideas in depth. They're iterating on those ideas. Like, you're not expected to be writing a perfectly peer-reviewed, cited paper every time you publish something on Substack, but there's also a level of intellectual quality that tends to go along with these publications that are a core part of, at least in my values ranking of the different informational inputs getting shared on the internet, fairly high on the list in terms of their value and their influence in this, to make a very messy metaphor, this modern republic of letters that we're kind of building, all of us internet people who are writing about things we find interesting online.
Yeah. Well, there's so many thoughts popping up. There are so many overlapping areas of interest that I have to break in here. But yeah, so I think people, I think people underestimate Substack and kind of don't understand what it is. It looks simple, like it's just like you can send out emails and you can make payments. That's basically it, right? And you can make comments and some chats. But when you see that, you think it's just a blog where you can get money. Like, but that's wrong. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. Like, that's not the logical endpoint of where this is going. And it's like that's like looking at Twitter and saying it's like a way to send text messages in public. Like, that was the original thing. But that's not how we think about Twitter today. Like, it's not about sending text messages in public. It becomes, that's just the primitives of it, the affordances. But then what you can build with that, that's the interesting thing. And I think Substack is going to evolve into something very interesting over the next 5 years when you scale it out, because it kind of, with those kind of primitives, like what it is like you can summon a community, which can't be censored because you've got the emails, you've got direct access, there's no algorithms, you can't be deplatformed and so on. So it's like a very kind of tight community structure that you can form. And then you can also pool money into that community, and it will be, usually it will be used to pay the writer, but communities can do different things with that. So I think we're going to see a lot of communities kind of evolve. It's not going to be about blogs. Mostly it's going to be, the writing is a way to attract the community for the most important Substacks. There are going to be Substacks that are just blogs, but the important aspects of Substack in 5 years, I think, will be that it is kind of a big network of small communities that are able to pool resources. And I hope they are going to add more and more tools to kind of integrate the community and moderate the community, because we know, like, having community moderation it's a much better model than what Twitter does when you're having kind of algorithmic moderation. And I think it's going to be, I think we're going to be surprised by the strangeness of what kind of comes out when you scale that out for long enough. We're really early on the S curve on Substacks. It's not going to be about just writing and paywalls.
How do you think it relates to the more traditional path of intellectual exploration, where if someone wanted to be, like you self-describe as a researcher, if someone wanted to be a researcher, the obvious track would be, well, you go to university, you get your undergraduate degree, you go on, you probably get a PhD, you probably work in academia throughout your career, you're researching and writing in this much more top-down, bureaucratic, traditional structure, as opposed to saying, I'm going to do this independently. I'm going to go start a Substack. I'm going to research independently. I can fund it in the long term, perhaps by having, like, utilizing Substack's payment structures or by some other means. I'm going to do this entirely independently. I'm going to work out loud a little more, work in public, share what I'm doing, get feedback from the world at large, which in some ways is the more meaningful feedback. Like, are you actually creating something that people care about? Are you interesting enough to hold people's attention and drive meaningful change, as opposed to writing something that other academics might find interesting, but no layman is ever going to want to read? How do you think about the difference between these two paths and or the future? Like, if someone was growing up now saying, I want to be a researcher, I want to deal ideas for a living, for my vocation, like, what types of paths are going to be logical for that person to follow as their trajectory starts to emerge?
I mean, it's wonderful that there are more paths opening up. I think academia for quite some time will still be a very valuable path for a person like that. You have a very sort of established structure. There is funding. There are mentors. There are, there are educational structures around it. So for a lot of people, that will make a lot of sense if you want to be a researcher. But if you're a weirdo, right? If you like, I was going to do a PhD, and I just didn't get along with the advisors because I felt like their directions of research were wrong. This is not an important question to ask. We shouldn't be doing this, and so on. And the only I found like two good advisors, but then I wouldn't have to go to, one was at Harvard and one was at Penn University. I didn't want to travel across half the world with my family to do it. It's just like a really intense life being an academic like that. If you want to have, either you have a really bad advisors and you get locked down, or you have to give pretty much everything up, maybe your family life and so on, to do it. But it can be amazing because it's like amazing structure. I don't think independent researchers are anywhere near like catching gravitational waves from black holes or something like that. Like, there are things we need to have those really big centralized structures for. But like, the independent paths that are opening up are really amazing for kind of this exploratory kind of research, where you're kind of picking up the crumbs that like these big colossal institutions can't get at. And that's something that we've been lacking heavily, because as more money has been piled into academia, there's also been more kind of people have been held accountable much more, and that has kind of reduced the amount of creativity. So they're really good at doing these kind of predictable big projects that are important, but they're not so good at supporting like Einstein's. So we need people. So it's really, really great to see that this kind of parallel ecosystem is evolving for people that are doing more crazy startup early stuff in research. So it kind of depends on kind of what you want to do, your personality. If you're someone like me, if you're pretty good at writing and think that's fun. I mean, I wasn't good at writing first, but I learned to be good at writing. And if you're obsessed with that, yeah, it's like really nice. It's so fun. You instead of writing for a journal and two people read it and you have to like hit your head on the wall for 4 months before they're accepted, you can just write it up over a weekend and then 10,000 people read it and then like 10 world experts email you and then you hop on a Zoom call and there's a seminar. Like it's so fast and fluid and it's most of the and you can be much more kind of throw stuff at a wall, because a lot of ideas are not worth working so hard on. Like, but it's really nice to just like, if I have an idea, I just write it up and put it out there. And sometimes I'll go deeper on it. Sometimes someone else will. Sometimes it's just a bad idea, but you can just move faster. And then you can, like, the good ones you go back to and you go deeper. And to have this kind of more fluid thing going is for someone like me just amazing.
I love that. I have so many other rabbit holes I want to go down with you. I feel like this interview could have gone 3 different ways and we could have discussed 3 entirely separate things and they would have been totally different and they all would have been amazing. We're going to have to do this again.
Yeah, sure.
Obviously there's your Substack, Escaping Flatland. Where else, if anywhere, would you send people who've listened to this and want to know more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, that's where I put my effort in. So if you want to see me with my best dress on, Escaping Flatland, .substack.com this is where I've got my fancy pants on. And if you want to see me like think aloud in messy ways, it's my Twitter, which I'm not going to try to say out. You'll have to put it in some show notes or something.
Yeah, I'll share it in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been such a fun conversation. Yeah,
it's always so fun to talk to you, Hannah.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. You've been listening to the Hannah Frankman podcast. Thank you so much for being here. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave a rating. Please subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week, friends.